In a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston, Claire Murphy lived with her husband Jason and their 5-year-old son Ethan. Claire worked from home as a freelance graphic designer while caring for her son. In the living room of their single-family home, sketches of corporate logos that Claire had designed were scattered about, next to colorful blocks that Ethan loved to stack. Ethan's development was delayed, and he could barely speak yet. While other children his age conversed fluently, Ethan tried to communicate his feelings through gestures and facial expressions. Claire had learned to carefully read each of these gestures, developing her own way of communicating with her son. Ethan received special education services, with a specialist teacher coming to their home 3 times a week. Though he had few words, Ethan was a gentle, thoughtful child who cared deeply for his mother. When Claire was cooking in the kitchen, he would gently tug at her apron with his small hands, showing his desire to help. Claire loved her son deeply. Her husband Jason worked as a sales manager and was frequently away on business trips. His days consisted of leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. When Jason came home, Ethan sometimes showed a slightly tense expression. Jason tried to be kind to his son, but there seemed to be a certain distance between them. Perhaps due to work fatigue, Jason rarely spent extended time with Ethan. Recently, the relationship between Claire and Jason had grown a bit cold. Their conversations became minimal, limited to only what was necessary, and the intimacy they once shared was fading. One evening, when Jason came home, he said with a tired expression, "Another exhausting day." Claire replied gently, "You must be tired. I'll make dinner." But Jason shook his head. "No, I'll cook. You rest." Claire was a little surprised. It was unusual for Jason to cook. But lately, these scenes had been happening more often. Jason stood in the kitchen silently, boiling pasta and making salad. While Claire felt bewildered by her husband's change, she was also grateful. Perhaps he was trying to be more considerate. Claire decided to think of it that way. One day, while Jason was preparing for a business trip, he said, "I'll be away for 3 days." Claire nodded. "All right. Take care." Jason pointed to the refrigerator. "I've put some meal prep in the fridge. I made enough for you and Ethan." Claire smiled. "Thank you." Jason picked up his suitcase and headed to the front door. Ethan stood by the window, watching his father intently. Jason got into his car and drove off down the suburban road. Claire and Ethan were left alone together. A quiet time settled over the living room as Ethan began playing with his blocks. Claire turned to her computer and started on a new design project. Outside the window, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, and fallen leaves danced in the air. It was an ordinary day, nothing particularly unusual. As evening approached, Claire began preparing dinner with Ethan. Ethan sat on a small chair, watching his mother's movements. Claire took out the meal prep Jason had made from the refrigerator and reheated it. Pasta, salad, and soup. The food had been carefully prepared. Claire felt her husband's kindness once again. The two sat at the table, eating quietly. Ethan brought pasta to his mouth with his small fork while Claire watched him gently. As night deepened, Claire felt a sense of calm. This small family, despite their individual challenges, truly existed. Claire stroked Ethan's head and smiled. About 2 weeks after Jason returned from his business trip, Claire began to notice something was wrong with her health. In the mornings, even when the alarm clock rang, her body felt heavy and she struggled to get out of bed. During the day, she would suddenly be overcome with intense drowsiness, and her consciousness would fade while sitting at her computer. Claire stared at her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her complexion had worsened. "I haven't been feeling well lately," Claire muttered to herself. She thought she must be tired from juggling both caring for Ethan and working. Her freelance work had strict deadlines, and she often worked late into the night on design revisions. Taking Ethan to and from his special education sessions and his daily care also took considerable time. It was natural that fatigue would accumulate. Claire told herself this. However, the exhaustion grew worse day by day. By afternoon, her head would feel heavy and her thoughts would become foggy. Sometimes during video conferences with clients, she couldn't find the right words. Claire began to feel anxious. Perhaps she should go to the hospital. But with her busy days, finding time to visit a doctor seemed nearly impossible. Around that same time, a change appeared in Jason's behavior as well. He started cooking at home more frequently than before. When he came home from work, before Claire could start preparing dinner, Jason would put on an apron. "I'll make dinner tonight," Jason said with a smile. While surprised, Claire expressed her gratitude. "Really? That would help so much." Jason stood in the kitchen, cutting vegetables and cooking meat with practiced hands. He was more enthusiastic about cooking than she could have imagined from the old him. Claire played with Ethan in the living room, pleased by her husband's change. Perhaps Jason was trying to make an effort for the family. Maybe it was a sign that their relationship was improving. Claire allowed herself to hope. However, strangely, after eating the meals Jason prepared, Claire was always overcome with intense drowsiness. She had no energy to clean up the table and would collapse onto the sofa. Her consciousness would become hazy, and sometimes she'd realize she'd been asleep for over an hour. "Why do I get so sleepy after meals lately?" Claire wondered. While it's natural to feel drowsy after eating, this drowsiness was abnormal. It was an irresistible drowsiness, as if her consciousness was being forcibly taken away. Claire began to worry that her health problems might be serious. Perhaps she had some illness. Words like depression and chronic fatigue syndrome crossed her mind. Ethan also seemed concerned about his mother's recent condition. One evening, when Claire had set out the dinner Jason had made and was about to eat, something happened. Ethan was sitting in his chair as usual, but he was staring intently at Claire. There was something intense in his gaze, as if he were trying desperately to convey something. Claire noticed her son's behavior and spoke to him gently. "What's wrong, Ethan?" Ethan didn't answer. For him, unable to speak, it was difficult to express his feelings. But his eyes seemed to be trying desperately to tell her something. Claire placed a plate in front of Ethan and asked again, "Are you hungry?" Ethan shook his head. Claire was confused. Normally, Ethan looked forward to mealtimes. Something was different today. Claire placed her hand on his forehead to check if he had a fever. He didn't. Ethan looked healthy, but his expression showed clear signs of anxiety. Feeling a bit puzzled, Claire began her meal. She twirled pasta on her fork and brought it to her mouth. Ethan watched intently. As Claire took one bite, then two, Ethan's expression grew increasingly worried. Claire put down her utensils and spoke to her son. "Ethan, what's really wrong? Are you worried about something?" Ethan pressed his small hands against his chest. It was his way of gesturing, trying to communicate something important, Claire felt. But she couldn't understand specifically what he was trying to say. Claire smiled gently and held Ethan's hand. "It's okay. Mama's right here." Ethan nodded silently, his anxious expression unchanged. Claire was concerned about her son's behavior but continued eating. And sure enough, about 30 minutes after the meal, an intense drowsiness overtook Claire. It became difficult even to keep her eyes open, and Claire lay down on the sofa. Ethan sat beside his mother, staring intently at her face. As the weekend approached, Jason began preparing for another business trip. He opened his suitcase in the living room, packing shirts and ties. Claire made coffee in the kitchen, watching her husband's back. Jason turned around and told Claire, "I'll be away for 3 days again." Claire nodded. "I understand." Jason pointed to the refrigerator. I've put meal prep in the fridge. Tonight's dinner is ready too, just heat it up and eat. Claire expressed her gratitude. Thank you. That really helps. Jason picked up his suitcase and headed to the front door. Ethan stood in the hallway, seeing his father off. Jason lightly patted his son's head and then left the house. The sound of the car engine faded into the distance, and silence returned. Claire and Ethan were alone together again. Claire exhaled deeply and sat on the living room sofa. The recent exhaustion had reached its limit. At this rate, she might not be able to continue working or caring for her child. Claire began to seriously consider seeing a doctor. But today, her body could still move. She would eat dinner with Ethan and go to bed early. That's what Claire decided. At 7 o'clock that evening, Claire took out the dinner Jason had prepared from the refrigerator. Pasta in a storage container, and salad in another container. They were carefully covered with plastic wrap, and sticky notes with reheating instructions were attached. Claire looked at the notes and smiled. Jason was really trying to change. She wanted to believe that. Claire began warming the pasta in the microwave. The low hum of the machine echoed in the quiet kitchen. Ethan sat in his chair at the dining table, silently watching his mother. Normally, Ethan would show a smile in anticipation of mealtime, but tonight was different. Clear tension showed on his small face. The microwave beeped, and Claire took out the warmed pasta. Steam rose, and the aroma of tomato sauce spread through the air. Claire carried it to the table and set out the salad as well. She prepared forks and napkins and sat down in her seat. "Papa made this food for us," Claire said to her son in a cheerful voice. But Ethan didn't nod, just kept staring at Claire. His gaze lacked its usual calmness, something urgent dwelling in it. Claire was a bit concerned, but hunger and exhaustion won out. She wanted to finish the meal quickly and rest. That desire was strong. Claire put her hands together. "Thank you for this meal." She picked up her fork and twirled the pasta. She wrapped the steaming pasta around her fork and brought it toward her mouth. That was the moment. Suddenly, Ethan stood up from his chair. The movement was quick and strong. And from the mouth of the 5-year-old boy came clear words. "Mama, no." Claire's hand stopped. The fork froze near her mouth, and a silence fell as if time had stopped. Claire stared at her son in disbelief. Ethan had spoken words. So clearly. Claire's heart began to pound violently. "Ethan." Claire's voice trembled. Ethan rushed to his mother with a desperate expression. Then he grabbed Claire's hand. Surprising strength was contained in that small hand. As if trying to protect his mother from something. "What's wrong?" "Ethan, what's wrong?" Claire asked, her voice shaken. Ethan couldn't continue speaking. His vocabulary was limited, and he couldn't speak long sentences. But his eyes eloquently conveyed something. Danger. Don't eat. That's what they seemed to say. Claire put down her fork. She squeezed Ethan's hand back and asked gently, "Is something wrong?" "Tell Mama." Ethan pulled his mother's hand. Claire stood up and followed her son. Ethan pulled Claire toward the kitchen. Then he stopped in front of the refrigerator. Ethan pointed at the refrigerator door with his small hand. "The refrigerator. What's there?" Though confused, Claire opened the refrigerator. Inside were the usual food items and drinks. Milk, eggs, vegetables, and containers of meal prep Jason had made. Claire didn't know what she was supposed to see. Ethan pointed toward the back of the refrigerator. Claire looked in that direction. Hidden behind the vegetables, a small storage container was placed. It was an unfamiliar container with a white lid. Claire picked it up. "This?" Ethan nodded firmly. The movement showed conviction. Claire held the container and studied it carefully. It was a clear plastic container, and something seemed to be inside. Claire opened the lid. Inside the container was something that looked like white powder. The amount wasn't much. About 2 teaspoons worth, perhaps. Claire frowned. What is this? Flour. Sugar. But why would it be stored in this location, in this kind of container? Claire brought the container close to her nose and sniffed. It was odorless. No particular scent. But something felt wrong. This powder wasn't an ordinary seasoning. That intuition welled up inside Claire. Ethan tugged at the hem of Claire's clothes. Claire looked down at her son. Ethan was trembling. His small body shook with fear, and tears welled up in his eyes. For the first time, Claire began to understand the seriousness of the situation. Ethan, what is this? How do you know about it? Ethan couldn't answer. But his expression told her everything. This was something dangerous. And it was in Mama's food. Ethan knew that. Claire's hands began to tremble. Still holding the container, she returned to the dining room. On the table, the still warm pasta sat waiting. Claire stared at it intently. Then she noticed. On the surface of the pasta, something that looked faintly like white powder was visible. On top of the red tomato sauce, fine white particles were scattered. Claire gasped. Her heart rang out like a bell being struck violently. Cold sweat poured from her hands, and her whole body began to shake. This is medicine. Claire's voice was hoarse. Everything began to connect. The recent abnormal exhaustion. The intense drowsiness after meals. Jason's sudden kindness. Making meals. Preparing meal prep. All of it pointed to one horrifying truth. Jason had been mixing something into Claire's food. Claire felt the strength drain from her knees. She sank into a chair, gripping the table with trembling hands. Ethan rushed to his mother's side and clung to her arm. Claire hugged Ethan. She felt his small body trembling in her arms. Ethan had known. Ethan had seen Jason mixing something into the food. Unable to speak, he couldn't tell anyone. But tonight, with his father away, Ethan had gathered his courage and stopped his mother. He spoke words for the first time, trying to protect his mother from danger. Claire barely held back the tears that threatened to overflow. Now wasn't the time to cry. She needed to stay calm. Claire took a deep breath and looked away from the pasta on the table. Then she took her smartphone from her pocket. She unlocked the screen and opened the phone app. Claire's fingers were shaking, but she managed to press the numbers. Claire put the phone to her ear and waited for the dial tone. Ethan clung to his mother, looking up at her intently. A calm operator's voice was heard. Claire answered in a trembling voice. I need the police. My husband has been putting something in my food. Please help me. The moment she spoke those words, something inside Claire crumbled. But at the same time, a strong determination sprouted. She could no longer run from this situation. She had to face the truth. And above all, she had to protect Ethan. 30 minutes later, the siren of a patrol car echoed through the quiet residential neighborhood. Claire opened the front door and welcomed 2 police officers. Ethan stood hiding behind his mother, watching the officers anxiously. The older officer asked in a kind voice, "We received your call. What happened?" Claire began explaining the situation in a trembling voice. The recent abnormal exhaustion, the intense drowsiness after meals, and Ethan's reaction tonight. Claire led the officers to the kitchen and took out the container with white powder from the refrigerator. Then she pointed to the pasta still sitting on the table. Something may have been mixed into the meals my husband made. The younger officer carefully examined the container and pasta. He put on gloves and transferred the contents of the container into a plastic bag. He also put the pasta in a separate bag and secured it as evidence. The older officer said to Claire, "We'll send this for testing. It may take a few days for results. Until then, it's dangerous to stay here. I recommend you evacuate to a safe place." Claire nodded. The officers conducted a detailed interview, recording information about Jason's contact details and workplace. An hour later, after the officers left, Claire and Ethan hurriedly packed their belongings. That night, the two checked into a nearby hotel. In the hotel room, Claire sat on the bed. It didn't feel real. It was like being in a nightmare. Ethan sat next to his mother and held her hand. Claire hugged her son and cried. Without Ethan, what would have happened to her by now? The thought alone was terrifying. The next afternoon, Claire's cell phone rang. It was from the police. Claire nervously answered the phone. "Mrs. Murphy, the test results are in." She heard the voice of the older officer. Claire held her breath. The contents of the container were sleeping pills and tranquilizers. Multiple drugs were mixed together. The same components were detected in the pasta. The strength drained from Claire's hands. She almost dropped the phone and hurriedly tightened her grip. Sleeping pills, but why? Her voice trembled. The officer continued. "We need to question your husband. Do you know where he is now?" Claire told them about Jason's business trip location. The officer promised to arrange it immediately. After hanging up, Claire collapsed onto the bed. Tears wouldn't stop. The husband she had trusted had been poisoning her. Accepting that fact was unbearably painful. 2 days later, Jason was called back from his business trip and arrested. He was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car. As neighbors watched with shocked expressions, Jason never once lifted his face. In the interrogation room at the police station, Jason initially denied everything. "I didn't do anything. Claire is mistaken." But the evidence was solid. Records of sleeping pills and tranquilizers Jason had purchased, the container with his fingerprints, and above all, the drugs detected in the pasta. Jason was cornered and eventually gave in. "All right. I'll tell you everything." The interrogator began recording. Jason exhaled deeply and began to speak. "I couldn't accept Ethan's disability." Jason's voice was low and sounded painful. "While my friends were raising normal children, I was the only one seen as the father of a disabled child. I hated it. At work too, when colleagues bragged about their children's progress, I couldn't say anything. I didn't know how to explain that Ethan still couldn't speak at 5 years old." The interrogator asked, "So you gave your wife drugs?" Jason nodded. "I thought Ethan's disability was Claire's fault. Because Claire pushed herself too hard during pregnancy. Because she let stress build up. That's what I came to think. I kept blaming Claire. In my heart, constantly." Jason covered his face. After a long silence, he continued. "I planned to put Claire in a psychiatric hospital." The interrogator frowned. "A psychiatric hospital? If I gave her excessive amounts of sleeping pills and tranquilizers, Claire would become mentally unstable. Her judgment would be impaired, and she'd be unable to function in daily life. Then Claire would be diagnosed with depression. With a doctor's diagnosis, I could have Claire committed to a psychiatric hospital." The interrogator asked with an incredulous expression, "And your son?" "I'd put Ethan in a facility. There are plenty of facilities for disabled children. Then I'd be free. I could start a normal life again." A heavy silence fell over the interrogation room. The interrogator asked quietly, "Weren't you planning to kill your wife?" Jason shook his head violently. "No, I had no intention of killing her. I just wanted to incapacitate Claire. So she couldn't leave me, so she'd depend on me. The interrogator asked the next question. How did your son realize what was happening? Jason showed a bitter smile. Ethan had seen it many times. Me mixing drugs into the food. When I was cooking in the kitchen, Ethan was always in the living room. I didn't notice. I didn't realize Ethan was watching intently. Jason's voice trembled. Ethan couldn't speak, so he couldn't tell anyone. But that child understood. That daddy was doing something bad. That he was trying to hurt Mama. Jason covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. This time, Ethan found the courage to stop it. He spoke words for the first time in his life and protected his mother. A 5-year-old child was so much stronger than me, his father. Jason broke down crying. The interrogator watched silently for a while, then finally said, "You betrayed your family. Your son is much smarter and much braver than you thought." The following week, Claire met with Jason in the interrogation room. Through the glass, the two faced each other. Jason looked at Claire with a haggard face. "Claire, I'm sorry." Claire looked at Jason with cold eyes. No tears fell. Her sadness had turned to anger. "You tried to abandon Ethan and me." Jason looked down. "I was weak." Claire continued speaking. "Ethan did nothing wrong. You just couldn't accept him. You just wanted to run away." Jason couldn't say anything. Claire stood up. "I'm divorcing you. I won't let you see Ethan either. Goodbye, Jason." Without looking back, Claire left the interrogation room. On the other side of the glass, Jason sat alone, holding his head. As Claire walked down the hallway, she took a deep breath. A new life was beginning. She and Ethan would live strong together. She was determined. The trial took place 3 months later. In the courtroom, Claire and Ethan gathered along with many spectators. Jason's premeditated crime was revealed in detail, and the prosecution demanded severe punishment. Jason was charged with attempted assault and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Claire took the witness stand and spoke quietly. He didn't love his son. He only cared about his own reputation. Jason kept his head down and said nothing. While the verdict was read, he never once looked up. In prison, Jason was isolated. The inmates despised the man who had betrayed his wife and child. No one spoke to him, and he ate alone in the cafeteria. Every day in his cell, Jason regretted his actions. Ethan's small face appeared in his mind. That child had been watching him. Had seen everything. And had found the courage to protect his mother. Jason buried his face in his pillow and cried silently. But it was too late. Claire and Ethan never came to visit. A year later, Claire and Ethan were living in a new apartment. In the bright living room, pictures that Ethan had drawn were displayed. Claire had resumed her work and was living a stable life. Her reputation as a freelance designer had grown, and she had gained new clients. Ethan attended a special education school and was growing little by little. His vocabulary increased, and he became able to speak simple sentences. His teachers were amazed by Ethan's progress. Perhaps speaking words to protect his mother that night had changed something inside Ethan. One autumn afternoon, Claire and Ethan were walking in the park. Fallen leaves danced in the wind, and gentle sunlight enveloped them both. Ethan held his mother's hand and smiled happily. Then he said in a clear voice, "I love you, Mama." Claire stopped and looked at her son. Tears welled up. She hugged Ethan and gently stroked his hair. "I love you so much too, Ethan." Several years later, Ethan was 8 years old. His vocabulary gradually increased, and he enjoyed his life at school. He was good at drawing and his talent was blossoming. Ethan's work won awards at the school exhibition and moved many people. One day, Ethan said to Claire, "Mama, back then, Daddy was doing something bad. I wanted to protect you. Claire looked at her son in surprise. Ethan had grown and could now explain that night in words. Claire hugged Ethan. Thank you. You saved Mama. Ethan smiled. I'll always be with you, Mama. Outside the window, blue sky stretched out, and a new season was about to arrive. Claire and Ethan looked toward the future together. There might still be difficulties ahead. But they were together. They were a real family who loved and protected each other. That was what mattered most of all.